Hi, I'm Ken Price, and this is Jane and Jane. Dr. Neal Bernard is one of the top medical physicians in the world. Dr. Neal Bernard is the president of Pcrm, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, a company that advocates a plant-based whole foods diet. Neal and the Physicians Committee have conducted research into alternatives to animal experimentation. Recently, Dr. Neal Bernard delivered an incredibly insightful and interesting presentation at a Pcrm event in New York City.
3 decades ago, you could go into any medical school in this country, and this is what you would have seen then. When I was sitting in Ross Hall at George Washington University, one day they said, dog lab is next week, and we all knew that that meant you take the dog, take him to the table, give him drugs, and at the end of the afternoon, you have killed your first patient. I was a cocky medical student. I said, I'm not doing it. And while the instructor was walking up to me to tell me it was required that I do it, another student sitting next to me said, he's not doing it, I'm not doing it either. And at that point, we had a movement. When we started the Physicians Committee, that was the first thing I wanted to get rid of. So we leafleted and we worked with instructors and we sued the bastards when we had to. And now we've gotten rid of animal laboratories from the curricula of 97% of the medical schools in the United States. Gotten a lot of teaching that to start. Then, on the heels of that, we learned about an Army experimenter named Michael Carey, who was taking cats and shooting them through the head as a model for head injury. He shot 700 cats through the head. Our researchers tackled this, went and complained to the federal government, complained to the Army, and we managed to get these canceled, stopped, he's out of business. On the heels of that, this is a little squirrel monkey. They are so tiny and cute, they could sit in your hand. We learned that NASA wanted to irradiate them with massive radiation to simulate what an astronaut would experience in space. At the Physicians Committee, Noah Gittell from our staff tackled that experiment. And what he did is he worked with the laboratory, and when they didn't want to work with him, he insisted that the citizens of Brookhaven would help him. He worked with Congress, he got experts involved, and this was a long slog. But Noah stopped that experiment. He brought in April Evans from the NASA. She was a NASA engineer. She resigned over this, and I'm happy to tell you NASA canceled those experiments. You probably heard the government of Taiwan wanted to inject rabies into beagles. And they wanted to experiment on the rabies virus, and they wanted to give it to these beagle dogs. There is nothing worse that you can do to an animal than to force them to froth at the mouth and have mental status changes and die a slow, agonizing death. We went to Taiwan. This is Mei Chun Lai. This is Sarah Kavanaugh. They're PhD scientists on our staff. They went over there and they showed that you can do the experiments you needed to do in the test tube. And it took a lot of slogging, but we got those beagle experiments canceled. You can't. This is at Aberdeen in Maryland, with this chemical casualty course where they would take vervet monkeys and give them chemical warfare drugs to show them writhing on the table. And this was a big job. We had to work with Congress. The members of Congress dragged the generals in and said, you got to stop that. These experiments were canceled. Now, sometimes people will say, well, why do we also deal with food and nutrition? How can that play a role? Well, I got to tell you something. If you look at meat going up, it has gone up and up and up and up. And Americans today eat 1 million animals every hour.
Oh my God.
But it's more than that. If you have a heart for animals, and you're saying, well, how does the food side fit in? The diseases that are caused by a bad diet, heart disease, diabetes, and certain forms of cancer, those are the excuse for animal experiments in many cases, right? And so it works the other way around. Many people say, I only care about health, I'm not interested in animals. I've got to tell you something. As long as researchers are saying, I'm going to cure cancer in a mouse or a rat, people ignore the lifestyle parts of this. So the two have to work together. We've got to work with the science and the research part. We've got to work with the prevention part. Now, you can change. 20 years ago, Dr. Dean Ornish said a plant-based diet can open up the arteries again. It's going to prevent that heart attack or that angioplasty. Our research team showed it's not just good for your heart, it helps you lose weight. And then the National Institutes of Health said, okay, why don't you test this with people who have type 2 diabetes? And this will not be on the test. But this is the conventional diet, this is the vegan diet, this is blood sugar control through something called hemoglobin A1C. And it turned out that a vegan diet was stronger than any of the oral diabetes medications that you could buy then or now. So then the American Diabetes Association said, okay, we'll recommend a plant-based diet, not because they wanted to be kind to animals, but because it was a great thing for health. And then PBS picked this up. Maybe some of you have seen the show that's broadcast about 7,000 literally times in communities across the country. And then, now I'd like to talk about your car insurance. Geico picked up on this and said, every time anybody fills a prescription, we pay for it. We need a vegan diet at Geico. And so we said, let's put it in the cafeteria, let's have discussion groups. This was new. The cafeteria manager had a few missteps about this. But they figured it out, and we did it as a study. At one Geico plant, they got no diet change, they didn't lose weight, but the people who went vegan lost weight very nicely. So then they said, let's do this in 10 different cities, from Macon, Georgia to San Diego, and it was tremendously successful. At this point, it's a no-brainer. You get the animals off your plate, people lose weight. If they have diabetes, they get better. And then we went to the White House. In 2009, we said, the pyramid, it's a nice shape. The people need to have a plate. Let's give them a plate, and while we're at it, let's get the meat group off of it. Let's get rid of the dairy. Now, I gotta tell you, we brought this to the US Department of Agriculture in 2009, and we didn't hear back. So in 2010, we sued the US Department of Agriculture, and it took them 12 months to respond, and I don't know if you saw what they came up with in 2011, but this is now official US government policy, and for the first, I'm not taking any credit for this, but it does look remarkably similar. For the first time in American history, there is no meat group. It could be meat, but it could be beans or tofu or tempeh. There's a lot of sources of protein. There's still the dairy group, but it includes soy milk. So we're not perfect. We're making progress. Okay. So meat intake started to sputter around, and then it started to fall, and it fell, and it fell, and it fell, and it fell. And right now, if you compare where we are down to the levels that we were at about 30 years ago. Right? If you have a heart for animals, every 1% drop is 100 million animals. Every single year. There are some challenges ahead. Take one, for example, heart failure. 5 million Americans have it, half of them are dead in 5 years. And you might think that to study heart failure, you might look at populations and identify risk factors, you might look at genes, you might perhaps study heart patients and understand what is it that keeps the heart healthy. Or you might look at blood tests and predict what things can threaten the heart. But unfortunately, at Wayne State University in Detroit, they had a different idea. This was their idea, was that they were going to create a model of heart failure in these dogs. That dog is named Queenie. Queenie was at a shelter in Michigan, bought by a dealer, sent to the laboratory at Wayne State University, forced to have heart failure, and ultimately killed in experiments that were cruel and completely unnecessary. And they are going on today, and do you know who's paying for them? You are paying for them through your tax dollars. We need to stop that.
Yeah.
If you look at alcohol-related problems, you would think that the government would say, well, to stop fetal alcohol syndrome, let's encourage women not to drink when they're pregnant. To stop accidents, let's get alcohol out of people's lives, and let's test how to do that best. We don't know how to do it the best way, but we need to learn. But at the National Institutes of Health, they have their own idea, which is let's get animals drunk.
Oh,
They will take animals, give them huge amounts of alcohol, cut the fetus out, and show that it damages the brain. And at Loyola University in Chicago, they had the idea that you might care about the big animals, but that you won't care about the little animals. So they're taking rats, mice, giving them a huge amount of alcohol, and then they break their legs to show that alcohol retards bone healing. They stick them into scalding water to show that alcohol makes it harder to heal from burns. Now, you might call that science, or you might call that some kind of sadism that has found its way into our lives, and that has to stop. Antibodies. Some of us were talking about this earlier. Antibodies are something that people are not aware of. They're used as little reagents. If I want to measure something in your blood, we use antibodies to pull them down to plates where I can detect them. But the problem is that they are derived in animals. There are laboratories all around the world, but especially in the United States, where they bleed animals every day of their lives, taking their antibodies and selling them. The Physicians Committee is now showing that you can make them in the test tube with no animals at all. They're cleaner, they perform better, and we aim to get the animals out of this once and for all. Now, if you have the idea that maybe your doctor doesn't know much about nutrition, well, we agree with you. We've entered into a new partnership with the University of North Carolina where we are making new education modules, and tomorrow I'm going to the University of Miami where we are going to be testing them. So my hope is that in a few years from now, when a doctor says, here's your prescription, wait a minute, you don't need a prescription. Let's change your diet, let's start there, and that's going to change the face of medicine. We have a partnership with GW where I'm on faculty to bring doctors who are already in practice to understand about getting animals off their plates. And we are about to file a lawsuit in California where, although every physician knows that bacon and sausage and ham is linked to colorectal cancer, we serve it to kids every day in school. We are suing in California to get it out. So my hope is that instead of these pictures, what we will see is research changing and using modern methods that spare animals, that advance research in a much better way. And instead of this old idea that so many of us grew up with, you've got to sacrifice animals. Well, let's get rid of that idea. And instead, let's talk about better science. And what I want to do is an investment. The idea is doctors need to invest a little time in learning to do things better, and researchers need to invest a little bit of time as well in learning modern technologies. And if we can do that, we're going to change science. We're going to not only help animals, which is important, we're not only going to help patients, but the next generation that is unfortunately in the worst shape that any generation has ever been can be turned around and they can be the healthiest generation we've ever had. That's our goal. Thank you very much.
With Dr. Neal Bernard at the front line in finding alternative and effective scientific methods to animal experimentation, I think this is a turning point in the medical industry. For more information about Pcrm and Neal Bernard, you can check out their websites, and they're on Facebook and Twitter. For Jane Unchained, I'm Ken Price.